We want as little interference as possible. So if everyone can have their phones on silent, we would appreciate that. So a very warm welcome to everybody, both in the room and joining us online virtually as virtual participants watching and listening in. We hope to have lively interaction from those people in the room. We have a good time for panel discussion. To our online participants, unfortunately, won't be taking questions from our online colleagues, but feel free to write comments in the chat box. So we welcome you on this morning to talk about what's in my food. a conversation on the regulations relating to the labeling and advertising of foodstuffs in South Africa, the new draft regulations that are out for comment. And I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. And to start us off, let me call up Miss Christine Mohingana, who's the UNICEF representative in South Africa. Christine, lovely to have you, and please come and share with us your opening thoughts as we get going.
Good morning, panel members, our partners in government, civil society, academia, and the media, of course, stakeholders joining us online this morning. Our moderator, a very good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF here in South Africa, to welcome you to this very important roundtable on food labeling. Effective regulatory approaches to protect, support, promote better diets and create healthy food environments for children are critical in advancing child rights and improving the physical and mental well-being of children across the country. Our discussion today on food labeling gives us the opportunity to put children's health first when it comes to the marketing of unhealthy foods and ultimately financial profits. This is not only right to protect the health of every child, but also it has the significant positive impacts on families as children grow up to be more economically productive and healthcare facilities are less strained by the long-term impacts of unhealthy diets that can result in a range of non-communicable diseases. But the prevalence of overweight and obesity among children and adolescents in South Africa today requires our urgent attention and response. This includes adopting and implementing progressive policy initiatives that seek to uphold the provisions already outlined in the country's constitution. The need for action to promote healthy diets and prevent childhood overweight and obesity is already well documented and articulated across global initiatives, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Rome Declaration on Nutrition, the United Nations Decade on Action on Nutrition 2016-2025, as well as the UN General Assembly and World Health Assembly declarations and outcome documents on the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases. These global mandates all call for effective regulatory approaches to address the obesogenic environment that is recognized as a primary driver of the problem. Families and children across the spectrum live in a society that too easily promotes the consumption of unhealthy foods through easier access, cheaper cost, and aggressive marketing. These issues are well recognized, and UNICEF welcomes South African government's initiatives to promote healthier diets and prevent childhood overweight and obesity. The publishing for comment of the long-awaited draft regulations relating to the labeling and advertising of foodstuff in South Africa are a very positive step forward. We are pleased to note that the draft regulations include key regulatory actions such as front pack labeling and the restrictions of advertising of unhealthy foods to children. As UNICEF, we advocate for and support food labeling legislation that mandates consumer-friendly front-of-package labeling to discourage the consumption of processed foods containing high amounts of sugar, salt, saturated and trans fatty acids. Such labeling provides information that children and families have the right to know so they can make informed choices at the point of purchase. We advocate for comprehensive regulations to protect children from the harmful impact of food marketing practices, including the World Health Organization's set of recommendations on the marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages to children. We also believe that strengthening other complementary policy initiatives, which includes the use of fiscal measures, such as the taxation of sugar-sweetened beverages, also known as a health promotion levy in South Africa, is critical in helping families to reduce their purchase and consumption of unhealthy foods and products. We are very pleased that the current draft regulatory framework includes some of these key actions and will help to promote healthier diets and practices in children. The impact of children growing up with the right nutrition cannot be overstated. Their learning ability, focus, and temperament, productivity, and long-term health outcomes are all improved when children nourish their bodies with the right foods. The United Nations Children's Fund encourages the relevant government departments and all partners, including across civil society, academia, and the food industry, to support the speedy finalization of these regulations to protect the rights of children here in South Africa. Regulations will need to be implemented in their entirety, including stringent monitoring and enforcing. On behalf of UNICEF, let me reaffirm our staunch commitment to working with the National Department of Health and all key stakeholders in putting the well-being of children in this country first. UNICEF stands ready to help ensure that these regulations become a reality for the full realization of every child in South Africa. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you for reminding us. And I think really my motto is always consumer health before corporate profit. And when it comes to children, often where they don't have the voice to speak out, we need to be that voice for them. And getting nutrition high on the agenda that it controls the food environment so critical. So thank you, Christine, for your words of wisdom. You might be wondering, how did we get here? What's the regulatory framework and environment in which we're working and living in? So we have asked the perfect person to come and present to us. So Ms. Makoma Bopape from the University of Limpopo is going to take us through a presentation just to remind us what are the steps, how have we got here, because it has been a long journey, but we can see the end in sight, and we're going to need everyone's support to push it over the finishing line. Makome, lovely to have you with us. Come and take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for this opportunity. It's lovely to be here and to share some of the work that we have done with the lovely group. My name again is Makoma Bopape. I'm from the University of Limpopo. And thank you to Ms. Christine Muligana for providing the background regarding the need for restrictive policies that will assist us in choosing healthier diets. So the question that you're asking this morning is, sorry, we now have draft regulation R337. It's not regulation yet, it's still a draft. I don't know what happened to the draft, but it's there, it's draft regulation. So I've been asked to summarize the work that we have done. This took about 3 to 4 years, and I'm going to be summarizing it in 10 to 15 minutes. So in terms of where we come from and where we are, we all know in 2010, we had the R146, which is currently in effect. And in 2014, there was then an update, and there was a draft, which is draft R429, which was gazetted in 2014. And there was public consultation in terms of what was contained in the R429. And since 2014 up to now, there was a revision in terms of the suitability, in terms of what needs to be put in, and so forth. And now in 2023, we are at draft R3337. That's where we are now. And I'm going to talk a little bit in terms of what type of work went into coming up with this draft and what we are supposed to be doing going forward. So in terms of draft R429, if we compare it to R146, the difference there is with the R429, there was now a suggestion to include the front of pack labeling, which was not there in the previous regulation, and also to include the marketing restriction. But after public consultations, then there were lots of considerations that went into what we are putting into the updated strategy, into the updated regulation. And in front of us here, I have things that the Department of Health took into consideration when they came up with the regulation 3337. And what went into consideration, of course, it's all the public comments that came forth. And also the Department of Health looked into what the WHO recommends. And regarding the recommendation, the WHO recommends an establishment of a front of pack label for each country that will be country specific, that will address the needs of the country. And as well, the WHO recommends a nutrient profiling model that has been tested and found to be applicable in the country of implementation. And as well, the nutrient profile model, as well as the front of pack label, should be the one that is based on science. And that is where research has been conducted inside that particular country. And as well, the WHO recommends the front of pack label that is visible, easily visible when one gets into the store, and the front of pack label that is simple to understand, that is easy for everyone to understand, including children. And also the WHO recommends a front of pack label that would assist South Africans or that will assist consumers to be able to easily identify unhealthy products which are high in nutrients of concern. And the nutrient of concern would be fat, would be sugar, would be sodium. So taking all this into consideration, the Department of Health commissioned the research in order for the researchers to do some groundwork in terms of what kind of label would best address all those recommendations and requirements by the recommendations by the WHO. So this is the group that conducted the study, and all this work started in 2019 up to 2021, early 2022, and it was Professor Rina Swart, Dr. Tamrin Frank, myself, Ms. Makoma Pupapi, and Dr. Safura Karim. So this is the group that did the groundwork. And in order for the group to come up with the label that is now proposed in the regulation 3337, we followed a 3-step process. I just want to get all of us in this room to understand why the label that we now see in the draft 3337. So what we did was we followed a 3-step process. The first one was to develop a nutrient profiling model. And as I said, within that would be specific for South Africa, that would be applicable in South Africa, and also to develop a warning label, again, that would be easily understandable by children, by adults in South Africa, and also to compare the different types of labels, because we have so many to compare the different formats, front of pack labeling formats, to see of those that we have, which one would ultimately be the one that is easily understandable. So we followed this 3-step process, and I'm going to briefly take us through each step. Some of the things I will not be able to cover, but during the discussion we can go into more detail on that. So in terms of the nutrient profile model, which is science of categorizing food based on the nutritional composition, this is what we did. We followed a 7-step process. And in each step, we asked ourselves various questions to make sure that whatever decision that we make would be something that would be specific to South Africa, because there are so many things that could be considered, but if they're not applicable and practical in South Africa, then we'd come up with a nutrient profile model that would be close to not of good use. So we took all the steps, and in the first step, we asked ourselves, what would be the purpose of the nutrient profile model? And let me take us through. I think it will be better to do this. So in terms of the purpose of the nutrient profile model, we looked at the South African context. What is happening in South Africa? And what is obvious is obesity is increasing in children, in adults. So we needed to come up with a profile model that would assist in fighting obesity and also in reducing non-communicable diseases, because we see the mortality is so high from non-communicable diseases. So the first determination was the nutrient profile model should be able to address this. And again, we also looked at what type of nutrients are we interested in, what type of nutrients would enable the nutrient profile model or the food front of pack label to assist in fighting obesity and non-communicable diseases. So I will answer some of the questions as we proceed. And the next question was, because we have so many models, do we develop one for South Africa or do we adopt the existing model? And given the fact that it takes so long to develop a nutrient profile model, the decision was to adopt the existing one, but also look at the ones that would be able to be practical in South Africa. So what we did was we took 3 different nutrient profiling models, and we compared them against each other. And I will explain as we continue. But the 3 that we considered are the SA Food Standard Australian, New Zealand nutrient profile model, because that is the one that was suggested in the R429. We also considered the Chilean one because of the evidence in Chile that this model assisted in reformulation of products, and also because the model assisted in identifying products that are unhealthy. And we also considered the PAHO one because a lot of research went into the PAHO model. So these are the 3 that were considered for South Africa. And in terms of which nutrients to include, the decision was we only include the nutrients that are associated with increasing non-communicable diseases. And I will present them at the end. I'm rushing through because I only have 15 minutes. So the decision was to take the nutrient of concern, because remember, the purpose of the nutrient profile model is to help in reducing the non-communicable diseases and obesity. And the nutrients that eventually went into the nutrient profile in South Africa were sodium, total sugar, saturated fats, as well as non-sugar sweetener, although it is not a nutrient. And in terms of the base on which we use the nutrient profiling model, different countries and different nutrient profile model apply different bases. So in order to make the profile model to be specific for South Africa, we considered, do we have cutoff points for all food items, or do we take different food groups and say for cold drink, for fizzy drinks, we will apply this criteria for biscuits, for cereals, for yogurts, and we found it to be cumbersome for South Africa because you need manpower to do that. You need a lot of resources to do that, and again, it's very difficult now to come up with. For biscuits, let's do this. For sugar, for fizzy drinks, let's do this. For yogurt, let's do this. So we found it better to have one model that we can easily apply across. And even in terms of monitoring and evaluation, it would be best to have one standard criteria for evaluating. And also, there was also an issue, do we use per 100 grams or per kilojoule or per serving size? But there were challenges, especially because if you look at the serving sizes, different companies use different serving sizes, so it would be difficult. So we considered all these nitty-gritties, and we looked at what would be best for South Africa. So at the end, then the decision was to adopt the Chilean winning octagon nutrient profile model because it met the criteria of how in South Africa we would like the nutrient profile model to function. Okay, and then the last step that we did was we then took the 3 nutrient profile model and compare how different food items would behave in terms of which one would assist us in identifying healthy food, unhealthy food. And of the 3, again, the Chilean winning octagon nutrient profile model came out to be the one that would assist South Africa. And then I will not go into the cutoff points because they are there in the regulation. So the second step that we took was we then decided to develop a winning label that because we did not have any in South Africa, and because research indicates that people understand the winning label, where the winning label is implemented. For example, in Israel, in Argentina, in Peru, in Chile. So we decided to develop one for South Africa and test it amongst the South Africans to see how they would perceive the winning label. And different considerations went into the development of the model. But before we could decide on which one to take, we conducted a qualitative study, and this study was conducted in 3 provinces: KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, and Gauteng. So what we did was we developed the model, but what informed the development was we looked at what South Africans would understand as a warning sign. So we considered different elements, for example, a stop sign, a triangle. So we looked into all those elements in order to assist us to come up with one sign that we would consider to be a warning label to put on food products. So we, as the research group, we also had an expert group that assisted us, where we bounced off ideas to say, we think we should put a triangle. What do you think? And the expert group would then say, no, a triangle, it's fine. If you make it red, then the red indicates danger. If you put it in black, the black indicates death. So things like those. So we took all those into consideration and then came up with a food label that we took to different people, and we asked them, when you look at this label, what does it say to you? And people would say, it warns me that this product is high in, for example, sugar. And other people would say, if I see this label, I wouldn't go ahead and buy. Other people would say, I like this label because my children will understand that there's danger associated with this. So we took all these we took all these discussions, and then we came up with one label that we then compared against 2 other labels. So the 2 other labels that we compared against were the GDA that we now see in the shops, And we also took the multiple traffic light that is in the R429, because that's a front of pack label that was suggested then. So we compared the three, and we wanted to see, of the three, which one would best resonate with South Africans. And when we conducted this study, this time it was a quantitative study, and it was done countrywide. And we had three groups. One group, we gave them the winning label, the other, the GDA, and then the other one, the multiple traffic light. And we asked three questions. And the one question was, when you look at this product, which one informs that a product is high in the nutrient of concern? We also asked them, which one tells you that this product is unhealthy? And we also asked them, which one would deter you from purchasing this product? So based on the three questions that we asked, the winning label performed the best in all three questions that we asked. And based on the results of the randomized control trial, because we compared different labels, the decision of the group was, this is the label that seems to be best understood by South Africa, and hence this is the label that was then recommended to the Department of Health to say, research has been done in South Africa. The nutrient profile model has been compiled, taking South African context into consideration, and the research group is now recommending that this label be implemented. And the final, as you can see, also included the, if a product contains artificial sweetness, let us also put a warning on that. And my second last slide is, we also looked at the legal aspects pertaining the implementation of the nutrient profiling model, as well as the food label. And we also looked into the marketing restrictions, what is feasible, what cannot be put into the R33 draft regulation 3337. We also looked into that, and we can talk more about that during the discussion. And hence, this is where we are. The draft is out there, and it's now out for public comment. And just my last one is the 4 new things now that are in the draft regulation 3337, the nutrient profiling model that we are recommending for South Africa, the front of pack warning label, and there's also marketing restriction, and there's also additional things in terms of nutrition and health claims. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Makoma, and I know we're going to have a really good discussion. So if I can ask my panelists, because what we wanted to make sure we did today was spend most of the time having a conversation. And so we're going to ask my panelists to come up and join me. We're going to be ready to take questions from the floor as well. Thanks, Pumla, for reminding me. There is water at the back. If anybody needs some water, please feel free to help yourselves. So it's a pleasure to have with us today 3 experts. Some who you've already seen have on the screen have been involved in the research that's been undertaken in South Africa. So let me first introduce, sitting opposite me, Miss Laurie Lake. And Laurie is an anthropologist by training, who's a communication and education specialist at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town. Laurie is well known to those of us working in the field of nutrition, and particularly nutrition and children's rights, because she plays a central role in the production of the annual South African Child Gauge, the most wonderful publication, Laurie. I highly recommend it if people haven't read it yet. And also convenes the Institute Child Rights Courses for Health and Allied Professionals, another much needed issue. So Laurie, lovely to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Also from Cape Town is Dr. Tamron Frank. And Tamron is a researcher at the University of the Western Cape in the School of Public Health. And as you saw from the slide that Makoma serves, she serves also on the technical working group advising the South African National Department of Health on nutrient profiling and front of pack labeling. So Tamron, lovely to have you as well.
Great to be here.
And third on our list, but not least, is Dr. Chantal Witten. Chantal is a senior lecturer and researcher at the University of the Witwatersrand in the Division of Pediatrics in the Faculty of Health Sciences. But today, Chantal is joining us in her capacity as the chairperson for HEALA, got to get it right, HEALA, the Healthy Living Alliance. And this is an organization that campaigns to ensure that all South Africans have access to healthy food. So wonderful to have you with us as well.
Thank you, Kay.
And then if those of you don't know me, my name is Jane Badham. I'm a public health nutritionist and I work globally, particularly in the area of maternal, infant and young child health, and consultant to many of the UN agencies and philanthropic organizations with a passion for this subject. I have been involved in food legislation for nearly 30 years of my career. So I'm also really excited to see this regulation in draft, hopefully finalized sooner than later. Laurie, I'm going to start with you because we've heard from Makoma the process and the intensive process that we've got to get here. But actually, let's take a step back and a step out and say, why are we even worried about child's nutrition in South Africa?
So I think it's very useful to start with me because I'm the one person in the room who's not a dietitian, or well, in the panel is not a dietitian or a nutrition expert. But my work has centered on understanding the situation of children in South Africa for the last sort of 15, 16 years. And in 2020, the South African Child Gauge focused attention on children's nutrition and food security. And what was very striking about that edition is that we have a double burden of malnutrition in our country. On the one hand, we're looking at more than 1 in 4 children in South Africa who are stunted. That means those children are not getting sufficient nutrients to grow and develop properly. It's not only that they're short for age, but that their cognitive development is compromised, and that obviously has implications for their education and their employment prospects. So I was familiar with stunting as a public health problem in South Africa. I was less familiar at the time with the problem of overweight and obesity. And what I didn't know back then is that 1 in 8 of our children are either overweight or obese, and that's children under 5. That's our very youngest, most vulnerable children, where nutrition is of critical importance. What we then see is that rates of overweight and obesity increase through the life course quite rapidly. So that when we're looking at women in South Africa, more than 2/3 of adult women are either overweight and obese. And this problem is growing year on year, and it is driving an epidemic or a tsunami. I mean, there are various words we've used to describe this growing burden of NCDs, non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and a range of heart diseases that are driven primarily by the consumption of ultra-processed foods in our country. And what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years are these massive multinational companies moving into South Africa, reaching into the furthest, most remote parts of our country, targeting our children as an emerging market. And that is what is driving our burden of overweight and obesity.
And I think in many ways that exactly starts us into the conversation of then why we would need these regulations, which I'll come to. I just want to say you talked about food security, and I know many of us talk about food and nutrition security. We might have some people that don't actually know what we're talking about in terms of what is food and nutrition security. So maybe just a little outlining of what do we mean when we talk about these terms?
It means that children should not only have enough food to eat. We shouldn't just be satisfying hunger. We need to make sure that it's not simply empty calories the children are eating. We need to make sure that they're receiving an adequate and balanced diet. that allows for optimal growth and development. So we're concerned not just about food security, but nutrition security. And that's about dietary quality. And that's something that Chantal could speak to very powerfully.
And that's what I was going to say, Chantal, let's hear about why do you think we need to have these regulations with a particular focus in that section on children and children's rights from your perspective?
Well, firstly, we know that in South Africa, Laurie explained about the burden of disease. But we also know that in South Africa, people are dealing with really hardship to put food on the table. So when they're making the choice to buy food, we'd like them to buy the best quality of food. And so these regulations go a very long way so that we can ensure that, one, people understand what they're buying, that Makoma showed us very nicely that people understand the warning label, so can make a distinguished, informed decision about what to buy. So when there's a label on it, I know the money I'm spending is not buying the best nutrition that I could have. But it also gives us an opportunity to push industry to reformulate, to make better products. It's not about banning foods, but it's actually to ask our retail and our industry to say, can we stop putting unhealthy foods on the shelf? Because we know the poorest of the poor cannot afford a quality food basket. And secondly, when we choose a product, we're actually displacing good products. If we're taking the money for less nutritious food, there's not enough money for whole foods. And that's where we want to get the South African diet, especially for children, to be this whole food, wholesome, healthy diet. And I think as healer, when we say access to food, it's about the choices of food, but also the economics to buy that food.
And I think that's really important, because what we know is many of these foods that are going to carry these warning labels often come in at a less expensive price than the foods that might not carry these labels. So I think we need to also, we'll come back to that, because I think that's a critical issue that we talk to as well. So if I come to you maybe now, Tamara, and just ask you, is we see why we need these regulations. It's very clear. But how do you, from the research that you've done, believe they will impact the health and the future of South African children? What have you seen in reading the literature and globally that makes this a really good move for us?
So I think what is really important to understand when it comes to obesity and overweight is once it's there, it's extremely difficult to reverse it. We find that, you know, people who are already overweight or obese do not very easily lose that weight. And there are very, very many reasons for that. If we can change the food environment before children are starting to become obese, we've got a much better chance of improving their health outcomes, because of course the obesity is related to these non-communicable diseases like diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. And so it's really, really important that we try to implement policies that are going to help from a young age our children to have a better outcome. And what we've been seeing is that other countries that have implemented policies like front of package warning labels and marketing restrictions to children. And I should add here that these types of policies are quite new. So there isn't a massive evidence base, because it's only been about the last 10 years that we're actually seeing these policies. And unfortunately, when it comes to researching health outcomes, it's not a simple 6-month process to see a change in health outcomes. It often takes decades to see it. So
we certainly have enough to be telling us that there's
so
numerous countries that we're not groundbreaking.
No.
We're following a precedent that is very clearly there, and the WHO even encourages.
And we're seeing Chile is the country that's probably got the biggest evidence base. And there what we are seeing is that children are learning from a young age that these foods with warning labels are not the types of food that they should be eating. In their country, part of their policy is that those foods are not allowed in schools. So research that's been done there is showing that children are telling their moms or their caregivers, don't buy this food, it's not healthy for me. Also, their food supply when looking at packaged foods has changed considerably. There's less sugar, less salt, less fat in the foods than there used to be as a result of these regulations. And so there certainly are positive outcomes.
And I think that's really important what you've touched on, because you're saying they are seeing that manufacturers are reshaping and reformulating their products. So to your point, Chantel, we mustn't be seeing this as, in fact, a negative, which I think is how some people would be portraying what's happening with these draft regulations. This is a real opportunity for us to not only in the public health capacity protect children, but also to really get manufacturers to rethink the formulations that they're doing and to actually put more positive consideration into what they're producing for us. What do you feel about that in terms of transforming the food system in some way, Laurie?
I think for me, another key insight that came out of the gauge was recognizing the ways in which our individual food choices are shaped by our local food environment. So Chantal has already said, when you head out to a spaza shop, what's on the shelves is often a whole lot less healthy than what you might see in Woolworths in the suburbs. So there's something about local food environments that is really important to consider. And the ways that those local food environments are shaped by these multinational corporations who are producing these ultra-processed foods in factories. They're shipping them halfway across the road, so not across the road, but across the world. They're filling them with all sorts of preservatives in order to maintain their shelf life. And they're also designing those foods to be highly addictive. There are all these food scientists who are specially trained to identify what exact blend of salt, sugar, and fat hits the sweet spot, but that makes us come back for more and more and more. So I've been looking at the box of cereal that we have on the table, and the kind of boxes of cereal that I grew up with had beautiful pictures of tigers on them. They talked about the food being healthy or full of vitamins, tasted sweet, crunchy. It was just absolutely fabulous. I could eat bowl after bowl after bowl of that cereal. What I didn't realize is it's also filled with lots of fat, lots of salt, all of it in excess. And yet the actual nutrient value of that food is very thin. So it's almost like we're selling our children empty calories that taste good. That's the one piece of it. The other piece of it is all the marketing that goes with it. If you look at the ads for chocolate or Coca-Cola, they're tapping into our deepest longings and fantasies, the longing to belong, the desire to spend time with an absent father, first love, a win on the sports field. All these high points of our lives are then moments where we expect to be celebrating with Coke or KFC. And that advertising is incredibly powerful. And it's targeted in many, many cases at children who are very vulnerable to that kind of marketing.
So really what we're seeing is on the one side, we're seeing this push through the marketing, and the other side, we're really seeing about the kind of decline in the overall quality of the diets. But Chantal, I want to come back to you because you started it off, and I think we've got to go back to that conversation. Help me understand the differences that you see between the quality of the foods we see in low-income areas, a major reality in our context, to what we see in the more affluent areas. Because we had a bit of an interesting conversation around this yesterday, and I really think it's important. Let's hear some of what you've experienced in this area. There are clear differences. We think what we're buying in South Africa is the same no matter where. That's not the case.
Absolutely, Jade. So the Global Nutrition Report, I think 2019, spoke specifically to inequity. And so inequity is a driver as well as an outcome. So as an outcome, poverty breeds poverty, and nutrition is fundamental to development. So as long as the masses who can't afford good quality food are going to be trapped in that poverty cycle, because it's not only robbing you today of your health, but it's robbing you, as Laurie said, your brain capacity your learnability, your education ability, which is a long shadow into your adult years. And we know that when you're malnourished, you at least 13% less in your wages. If you're a day picker or you are a laborer outside, you will not be able to access the kind of jobs that an educated person would have. And so it keeps us trapped in poverty. What we recognize and what we've seen with some of the work that has been done by Dr. Jane Battersby from UCT is that these new large multinationals are moving into our low-income areas. The foods, as Laurie explained, are cheaper because they're highly processed. You can make them in bulk and you can have them there in bulk. When you see the child support grant being paid out at the end of the month, just look at the newspapers, look at the combos. Those combos are highly processed, no quality food in it. Flour, sugar, maize meal, also highly refined, all to make the kinds of foods that children are snacking on the whole day. So I was involved with a piece of work with the Black Sash, which looked at households that got the income and what they could afford. And what we saw in those households is that you're never going to see high quality meat. You're never going to see dairy. You're never going to see eggs. You're never going to see whole milk because it's just too expensive. 540 Rand doesn't buy you high quality.
So you're going to see the polonies.
You're going to see the polonies. You're going to see the magunyas. You're going to see the melkkos, which is basically just flour and butter, and it's stretched over time with lots of sugar. Because again, I want to come back. When your food is monotonous, the only way to make it taste nice is sugar or fat. We all know the bowl of porridge, maize meal. Nobody eats a bowl of porridge. I don't eat a bowl of porridge without sugar, without fat, without cremora, because it just doesn't taste nice. So poor households have monotonous diets, and the monotonous diets have to be enriched to taste nice, or palatability needs to be increased. We don't see that in high-income areas. You can go to high-income areas, you're never going to find hard margarine in your top retailer. You're not going to find the brick margarine there. When you go to a low-income area, which has one of those, what do we call them? The big shops, bulk buyers, you're never going to find a tub of soft margarine. And we've got to ask ourselves why. And it's the inequity agenda. And I think as a consumer, or let's say civil society, we need to create the demand. We've got to educate mass. So we talk about public health literacy. America's got Eat Right America. India's got Eat Well India. South Africa needs a public health literacy so people can make those choices and understand what I eat affects my body. You are what you eat. Sorry, but if you eat junk, your body's going to be junk. It's going to start falling apart. Liver's not going to work that well.
And yet what you eat is shaped by where you are.
Absolutely.
So this is what you're saying. It's this, it becomes this
Perpetual.
vicious cycle. Tamara, you want to add in?
Yeah, I think the other thing that one needs to also take into consideration here is that these unhealthy, ultra-processed foods that are often quite cheap, that are causing diseases like obesity and non-communicable diseases, also have a massive long-term economic impact. So on the short term, it might be a cheap food to buy immediately, but it is causing, and there's been quite a lot of research done into the economics around it and the loss of health and what that means in terms of people's ability to go to work and days lost because they're at the clinic getting treatment rather than being at work, and what that does to one's household income at the end of the day. So it really, really, you know, Chantal spoke about this vicious cycle of poverty, and it really just feeds back into that, that if we don't do something, Laurie was saying, these multinational companies that are just selling a proliferation of ultra-processed food, if nothing is done to hone in on that and to limit and to restrict these unhealthy foods in the food environment, we're going to be sitting with a massive, massive problem.
We're already sitting with the problem.
Yes.
Laurie, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to...
And I'm going to come to the audience as well, so be ready to happily add to the conversation.
Yeah, I also just wanted to introduce this concept of slow violence. And we use the concept of the slow violence of malnutrition to capture what is happening. So when we go out and we buy our children a bottle of Coke or a packet of chips or a chocolate, our immediate experience is that that's a treat. It's something we save up for, and as a child we treasure these sweet and salty snacks. But what we don't see is the slow violence that is unfolding in terms of the child's developing body and brain. And in fact, we only start to see the effects very often much later in life. And so one of the things that we're needing to do in building awareness of the need for these front of pack labels is to help consumers recognize that what tastes good and tastes sweet, all that sugar coating, actually causes long-lasting damage. And it's driving what I think both Tamara and Chantal were saying, it's driving an intergenerational cycle.
And I think
of
what's
poverty
really
and
important,
health.
what I'm hearing from is that we have to get consumer demand, because often the manufacturers will be saying, but we're doing these things to decrease the costs of products, so that the description that you've just said, Chantal, that they can buy these products. But linking that to your point of, well, that is slow violence, really starts making it, we need consumers to really demand these kind of warnings and information.
I think the other thing we need to be asking is who profits from the sale of these goods and who carries the costs. And there was a fantastic Lancet series launched earlier this year on what they call the commercial determinants of health. And that includes the food industry, oil and gas, alcohol, tobacco. And what these industries do is they are reaping huge profits. But the people who are carrying the cost of ill health are the individuals with diabetes, with hypertension, and their families, as well as the public health system. So we as a society carry the costs, and industry reaps the rewards. And in a sense, what these regulations are doing is the state stepping in to protect the rights of our youngest consumers and their health from commercial exploitation.
And that's a good segue for me to ask you, Tamron, is I think we also just need to clearly understand that this law is doing two things. So we have the front of pack labeling, but we also then have restricting marketing to children. So just give us kind of the difference between the two and how these two are being balanced. Because in one hand, we're doing good for everybody, but we're also really focusing that particular good on making the restrictions specifically for our children who are our most vulnerable.
Yeah, so the regulation requires any packaged food that contains excessive sugar, saturated fat, sodium, or any sweetener to carry a warning label on it. And then those products that carry a warning label will not be allowed to be marketed to children. Of course, in South Africa, a child is defined as anyone 18 and younger. So it is quite a broad range, which covers most marketing, which is fantastic. And we're really, really excited about the potential that has to protect. I think anybody who's been to a shop ever with a child will know that they are immediately caught by the cartoon characters on the boxes, by what they've seen on TV at home during the advert breaks, that they're remembering when they're walking down the aisle and seeing pictures. And there's now going to be a protection in place that those characters will not be allowed to be on these unhealthy products, which I think is quite exciting. And
so Chantal, I'm going to ask you this question because I know you've got an example that you can give us is, well, why do we need to do it through the law? Why don't we just go through self-regulation, voluntary pledges? Why do we need to go to this extreme and legalize it?
I think the example comes from breastfeeding. So the infant formula, we had a voluntary code that South Africa signed up to and committed to since 1985. but the regulations only came into effect in 2012. And so between 85 and 2012, breastfeeding rates were at its lowest in South Africa. 2012, the regulations R991 came into effect, and the data of 2016 showed that actually breastfeeding increased by 5-fold. And that explains how the regulations is powerful enough to hold the industry back. So you do not have adverts of formula. You do not have a billboard of formula. You will not find formula as you walk straight into the supermarket, because that's what the regulations prohibited. And the education that went with that is that finally the message in the kind of communities and in the general public is that breastfeeding is a better option than formula feeding. We still have a lot of work to do, but what it did show us is that when it's a law, industry will have to abide. When it's voluntary, we can do it. When we want to do it, we don't actually want to do it. Because
And when it
it's our
comes to our
product.
profit, we're not going
And we're
to
not going to do it.
negatively impact on what's going to be our profit.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think R337 needs to take lessons out of R991, because one, we know that it must be monitored, and in the infant feeding space, we had very active civil society doing the monitoring, looking at the violations, reporting the violations, both to Department of Health, both to UNICEF, making a big noise about it when it was found.
And
the same is
Christine
needed.
also said that in her speaker notes. She said that we also need to make sure that we are talking about the monitoring and enforcement. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, do we? What do people feel about? That's the hardest part, I think. Often is actually carrying through on the monitoring and enforcement. Tamron, what does this draft regulation? How do you feel? And do we feel again it's going to be civil society's role?
Yeah, you know, I think it's a challenging topic. There are lots of things that play into it. We know that resources in terms of people are limited at the Department of Health, which often plays a role in how well monitoring and evaluation is enforced. I certainly think there's a lot of space for better monitoring and evaluation to take place, because we have quite a lot of nutrition policies in the country that are pretty well written. But unfortunately, when it gets to the implementation phase, we tend to have a bit of a hold up there. So this is certainly something that needs to be looked at more, and that I think we need to be putting pressure on government to help. You know, it's fantastic when civil society is involved. We also want to make sure it's sustained. So the R991 is still in place that you spoke about. There was a lot of effort, but going forward, are people going to
Laurie,
remain
what kind
involved?
of pressure do
And
you feel will need to be put on, and what can people, you know, like the Children's Institute and the work that you do, how do we keep that pressure going?
So I think it's also a question of education. Educating consumers is one piece of it. Educating health professionals is another. Educating those professionals responsible for advertising and marketing, who have no background or awareness of the public health implications of the work that they do. Pulling those threads into the education of a whole range of professionals would be incredibly helpful. My sense also, again, from my experience with R991, is that any kind of implementation and or enforcement and monitoring is a joint effort. And working hand in hand with the National Department of Health will be absolutely essential.
Tamron, are there plans, we talked about limited research. I presume there are plans in place that when this regulation comes into place, there'll be studies that immediately are clicking in to start seeing impact and effect?
well, we certainly hope so. I don't know that the Department of Health has invested their money into.
But is
doing that,
academia
which should be
looking
part
at
of it.
ways?
But academia certainly is looking into it. I would say there are plans in place.
Because I think
allowing.
that's going to be really critical, because
Certainly.
the sugar tax
Certainly.
really showed that it was having that ongoing research showing the impacts and the changes that it is important, as well as the education component, Laurie.
And there's a food consumption study that's just taken place now. So we've got a really nice baseline to work from.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, if you're thinking about the long-term effects into your adulthood, we're going to need to track this for a significant period of time, including what's happening for overweight and obesity in young children, because in a sense they are the canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
And if we don't get things right for those very youngest citizens in our country, then, as Tamron says, we're going to carry those costs.
Taryn, you shared with me, if I remember correctly, some idea of kind of how many of these kind of foods South African consumers are already eating, that the researchers had, was shown when you were doing the research around this. It was quite frightening figures that you came up with.
Absolutely. So we looked at the packaged food sold in the largest supermarkets in South Africa, particularly the packaged food. So this excludes your fresh produce, but within the packaged foods, 76% of our packaged foods are ultra processed, which is an alarmingly large number of foods. We also did some research in some low-income communities in South Africa, Langa and Khayelitsha in the Western Cape and Mount Frere in the Eastern Cape. And we found that approximately 40% of the diet is ultra-processed. And although the warning labels does not use the criteria for ultra-processed, the majority of the warning label foods are also ultra processed.
So it has the double.
And so the numbers are fairly similar in terms of that. And we saw that within the low income communities. Of course, this was based on what the food supply looks like now. We know that when the regulation comes into place, there will be reformulation of products. So there won't be as many products that have warning labels.
And that's exactly what we want to see. That's the opportunity we're looking for.
Precisely. But currently, almost everybody was eating at least one food. 92% of the participants had eaten one food on the day before that would have a warning label on a minimum of one food. Somewhere.
Think about yourselves, everybody. I did this exercise yesterday, and I don't want to admit to you, I was doing fine until I came to dinner time, and wanted to add some sauces and things. I was like, whoa! And then I started realizing actually I hadn't done so well at breakfast either.
Yeah, I think that's what's so exciting also about the front of pack labels. I don't know if any of you have looked at the nutritional profiles on a bar of chocolate or a loaf of bread, but they're written in, especially for me at this stage of my life, they're written in tiny writing, often in language that's difficult to understand. Even when you can read it, you're not sure, is this healthy, unhealthy, has it crossed the line or not? So I think one of the really exciting things that we can be doing, even within our classrooms in terms of schools, is taking a look at the products on our shelves and assessing.
And I think
will they have a warning label or not?
Also, an important point is to remember that this is one element of what R337 covers. So R337, it covers a wide spectrum of areas that people will be setting comment on, and addresses many of these kind of areas, changes and improvements along the way. So, we need to be looking at it. We're talking about a particular area of R3337, but it's a really important one, and we're going to need to comment on. Let me turn to our audience, because you've been hearing the conversation, but you're part of our conversation. Anybody want to share any? It doesn't have to be a question. Many of you are experts yourselves, have been involved in research on these areas, come from civil society groups. So let's hear from you. Would anyone like to give us a comment or a feeling on what you've heard about this regulation and how you feel about it? Anyone want to kick us off? Super. I know there's a microphone coming for you. So if we can just speak into the microphone so our onliners can also hear.
Okay, thank you.
And please just introduce where you come from before you speak.
I'm Matia from University of Limpopo. Right, thank you for the enlightening about the front of the pack labeling. Yeah, I'm just worried, especially when it comes to monitoring side. For the less affluent and poorer side of the communities, worried especially about counterfeit goods. You can find a perfect pack of cereal at the spaza shop somewhere, whereas the original maybe packages have done the right thing of all the label, but at the spaza shop down somewhere in the Bundus, you'll find that it's a counterfeit product. So I'm sort of concerned about the monitoring of such, but at least I think it was you, Tambrin, saying something about maybe Department of Health, making sure that they get the monitoring systems into order, or at least involving other agencies to make sure that the monitoring is good, because it will be pointless to have the public understanding the labeling, but then when it's not monitored, what exactly is in the good, whether it's real, even if it's ultra processed with labelings, whereas in the counterfeit is something else. So that was
So in theory, of course, that's got to be the role of the Department of Health. And I don't think any of us here can particularly answer for them. But it's about the Department of Health making sure that they've trained the people that have to do the enforcement. And I know that they also have limited resources. Often in the past, when I've been part of these debates, these are the same environmental health officers that are having to check, the contamination of water that is. And we have someone who I know knows, has that experience. So yes, the monitoring enforcement again is going to be something that I think it's going to be the next step that civil society and us as consumers are going to have to start really demanding. Because yes, if we put this fabulous regulation in place and we don't monitor and enforce it, you might find that you'll have some complying and some not. And counterfeit foods and goods is always going to be another problem, and it's one that I don't know that anyone here can truly answer. But Laurie, you've got some thoughts.
I was just sort of reflecting back that nutrition really hasn't been a key priority area for us in South Africa, certainly in terms of investment. But we do have a national food security and nutrition policy. We're about to have a council established, which speaks to political commitment, political will, and hopefully leadership. And hopefully with those things and a growing recognition of the impact of overweight and obesity, there will be the resources put in place to make the regulations and the vision behind the regulations a reality, that we create a healthy food environment for our children.
I also think that what we'll probably see happening is that, if one manufacturer is doing it correctly, once this is enforced, they're going to be watching out for their competitors themselves. And you might have, this is where you might have some own kind of reporting each other and saying, well, if I'm doing the right thing and I've gone to all this effort, because reality is every single food label in South Africa is going to have to change. When you look at the whole of our 3337, it's going to be significant. So you might also start having some of kind of that in self-enforcement between companies. But counterfeit foods remains always an issue. Anyone want to add? Chantal?
I just wanted to add to what Machi brought up now, because in the poorest of the poor areas, we do have resizing of packaging.
Yeah.
And people are buying on a daily basis 2 teaspoons of sugar, 1 tea bag. We do have that happening. And so I do think, I'm not going to talk to the counterfeit side of things, but I do think there must be a realization that what we are talking about at kind of the high level, reformulation, repackaging, and the regulations, how does it really translate to protecting the people who need the most protection? I also want to raise, for me, a gap in the regulations is the fact that infant formula is not included, while childhood obesity starts from infant feeding. And so while we're raising the awareness and people will be going to read the regulations, also please think about the youngest child. Because if you want to protect obesity, you have to start with infant.
Would people not say that's covered by 991?
No, R991 is covered in terms of the marketing of where you can place it, where you can actually, how you may actually promote it. But I think if you include it in R337 as part of ultra processed food, then you're going to have real, I want to say, complete protection, because it's not a healthy food. It is needed, understood, there is place for it. But in terms of its composition, mothers still and many health professionals don't recognize that formula is a formulated milk, which is an ultra processed food. And I think by putting it into our 3337, we actually stating it as an ultra processed food with its labels on the sugar content, on the fat content. And for me, that would make a big change as well.
Great thought. Yep. Thank you for that question. Yes, if we can get the microphone to our colleague. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you, Maria van der Merwe, representing ATSA, the Association for Dietetics in South Africa. Moderator, I have two questions that are not related, so you can maybe bank them or add them where you want to.
Let's hear them.
So the first one is on a legislative level. Well, thank you to Mail and Guardian and UNICEF for making this discussion possible, and we do welcome our 337. So asking myself, if we look at a strategic approach overall, when you have something like R337 coming in and response from industry in terms of reformulating, etc., we are also sometimes then asking ourselves, but what's the impact fiscally? Is there going to be commitment politically/economically to allow for that? In other words, if argument sake, profits may be different, what's the impact in terms of tax and revenue, which again goes into public funds? At the same time, in terms of policy, what needs to happen from our side as professionals, professional organizations, civil society, researchers, when it comes to other legislative support, looking at, let's use the term whole foods, for whole foods to be more affordable and accessible, produced, for agriculture to want to produce it because there's a place for it and a market. And then also touching on what Laurie has been mentioning, again, legislative policy in terms of nutrition education, starting in our schools, having our own South African guidelines, but I am yet to meet an individual outside of the nutrition fraternity that has ever heard about it. So again, we welcome our 337, but we are also saying so much more needs to happen at the same time. The second question, or kind of comment/question, that I ask myself, and again, Laurie, you've mentioned, that fabulous combination of sweet and sugar and salt. That's just spot on. And interesting enough, I think it comes from breast milk that actually has that bliss point, and trying to get that again. Warnings on sugar, warnings on artificial sweetener. Welcome both, but what on earth is the solution when it comes to palatability? Chantal, you've mentioned we add stuff to make it taste better. And that's just a kind of question I've been milling around in my mind. So, really now between a rock and a hard place. And especially when it already comes to current regulations, if your product is aimed at children under R991, the triples and the doubles, already artificial sweetener is not there, but we don't want sugar there. And now it's the entire kind of collective of food on the shelves. So just some thoughts there. We're not maybe representing the food scientists and the ones coming up with the solutions, but just a question around that.
I think those are both very good questions, and I saw nodding from the panel. So let's turn to the panel and see what thoughts you want to add. Not necessarily that we've got the answers, but I think the key thing that you are saying is that we cannot see a regulation as being the end of it all. and that's the tick. We've seen enforcement needs to happen. We've heard, and you agree, that education has to happen. And then you start hitting on my passion button is just putting a little pamphlet together considered education that actually changes behavior? It becomes a much more complex issue. What kind of budget is allocated to when we just say education easily? Let's hear some thoughts. Chantal, I saw you had
Yes.
something, and Laurie, I'm sure you'll want to add as well.
And I'm speaking now as healer, and what healer would like to see in terms of achieving its mission, all South Africans having access to healthy food, means that we need to look at the gambit of instruments that we have, the gambit of programming and policies that we can put in place. And the child gauge had a set of recommendations about macro policy interventions. For one, South Africans don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. If you want to talk about whole foods, that's where we need to go. So we do need the council. We do need the political will so that we can have this intersectoral discussions, planning, coordination, and execution. Because what we're currently doing now is each institution, each department is working on its own. It's not working in concert to make this music. You know, the violins are playing loud and then the piano is coming in, and it's not making sense for South Africa. And so for me, the National Food and Nutrition Policy has to be communicated at this council level. Otherwise, we're not going to win it. I personally want to put my money behind macro policy interventions that make food available and affordable. And that's why the regulations is an entry point. Because if you want to take all these foods and put the warning labels on, what are you replacing it with? And it has to be the fruits and vegetables. It has to be.
And
the
this,
whole
as I say,
grains.
cannot be an end in itself. This is just part of the bigger journey that we've got to be taking, and we've got to be pushing on. When is this council? I've been hearing about it forever, Laurie.
I'm not part of the National Planning Commission, nor
no
am I part of the
insider
committee, but I
information.
believe it's nearly there.
If we keep
So
pushing.
touching wood.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that's really interesting about South Africa, you touched on the broader, the broader food environment and food production, and just really interesting that we're importing a lot of these ultra processed food, and we're exporting our fruits and vegetables to Europe. And that's.
I mean, for many years, I was the head of the 5 a Day for Better Health Trust in South Africa, and we had to close down because there was just not the financial support for trying to promote the 5 a Day fruit and vegetables. So it's got to be part of this bigger picture. Tamron, you want to add as well?
I mean, just to add to that, asking the question of, we're raising revenue from sugary beverage tax, the health promotion levy. We could put a tax on foods that have warning labels on them sometime in the future.
But then my question would be, where's the levy going?
Precisely. If we're going to do something like that,
It's got to be
money should
ring-fenced
to subsidize the healthy foods for those who need it the most. And that is, I think, where we really are lacking. And then perhaps just to touch on the other part of the question, which was around the sweetness. And I think that we need to acknowledge, I think we've been speaking now about we're not eating enough whole foods. Changing the sweetness or changing the profile of a sugary beverage by adding a artificial sweetener or a non-sugar sweetener to it doesn't change the sweetness of the beverage. It remains sweet. And we've seen since the introduction of the health promotion levy that there are now more of these non-sugar sweeteners in beverages.
In fact, you virtually cannot. I was doing some research yesterday. You almost cannot buy something,
including some that were adamant that they were not changing their recipe, that have changed their recipe very recently.
Yes,
that does not teach, particularly children who are learning tastes, not to have this real want and desire for this very, very sweet food. If we can change the types of foods that are normally available and eaten regularly on a day-to-day basis to things that are not manufactured in a sweet that to that extreme level of sweetness, it can become more normal to eat less sweet foods.
And I think that would be part of
And
what the hope of the warning label will be,
precisely,
is that
that we move
families will
away.
move in a direction away from products that are carrying these warnings, or at least be aware at how many of the products they're using now have to carry a warning.
And so that's where the sweetener has a role to play, where we've seen in a country like Chile that doesn't have a warning label for sweeteners, they've got a massive influx of sweeteners in all of their foods on the market. We're seeing in South Africa there's been a proactive approach to try and prevent that from happening here, so that we can really try and push a move away from these ultra-processed products towards more of the whole foods that we would like to promote and encourage people to eat.
I was wondering if maybe you could just talk a little bit about what we call the nutrition transition. So I'm aware that some countries like America and England are way ahead of us on this obesity curve. How is South Africa doing in relation to other countries in the world, and how worried should we be?
So the nutrition transition, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, refers to a change in how one consumes food, the dietary habits of a country, as a result of industrialization and the changes from, when you look back 100, 200 years ago, where you had to go and milk your cow yourself and you were growing your own foods, to now walking into a supermarket and buying foods, how that has changed the types of food that we've eaten. Together with that, we've seen this massive rise in obesity and non-communicable diseases. And so the countries that are higher income tend to have had more of an impact, and the lower income, we're seeing it happening more and more. And what we see is that in the high income countries, it's predominantly the low income people who are eating most of these very unhealthy foods, because the people who are middle income and upper income are able to afford healthy fruits and vegetables. Whereas in countries like South Africa, where we have very high levels of poverty, we're seeing everybody eating a lot of these ultra-processed foods, and we're seeing our obesity levels increasing. What is very, very scary to note is that no country in the world yet is seeing a reduction in obesity rates. There have been one or two of the very high income countries where there's been a leveling off, where they've managed to start not having an increase in obesity levels, but no one has gotten it to move around, change yet, to reduce.
And in fact, the
obesity.
WHO target is actually just to stop maintain. Then the target isn't even yet to decrease. It's
and South Africa's rate is alarmingly increasing every year.
So that's why I think what we're reminding is that this regulation, although we focused a lot on children today, it's the regulation in its biggest component is for everybody. But it's also not just going to be the magic bullet that this regulation is going to change. We're going to still need to have the incredible inputs and the continued struggle, because so often we just say, that we've got to make it available and affordable. I almost get tired of hearing this constant, we just need to make healthy foods accessible, available, and affordable. Those are so easy to say, but I mean, what you've shown us, Chantal, and what I see in my own experience, that is incredibly difficult to do, because when you are fighting against these products that come in significantly less expensive than buying your whole foods, and you are sitting in a country where we've got a food crisis, income crisis, an unemployment crisis, it's really hard for us to be saying to our consumers, you must.
I don't think we're saying you must. So, I think that's the other really important thing about the labels. It's informing you of what's in your food. And it's enabling, absolutely, an informed choice at the individual level. It's encouraging the reformulation, but it's not saying these foods are banned. You're not allowed to eat them.
Would we in any way potentially, sorry, I know you want to come in, would we in any way be potentially stigmatizing both the products and the people that choose these products in any way? Tamron, come in on what you wanted to say.
Well, it's just taking a step back from that, but I just wanted to add that I don't think we must minimize the food industry's role in all of this.
Yeah.
The food industry has spent a massive amount of money to make us feel like it's our fault
Exactly.
for what we're eating. And there's been a lot of research done into show
Exactly.
that, there's been this push to say, if you just exercise more, you'll lose weight. And that's just simply not true. So the food industry has done a fantastic job of making us believe that it's our fault. And that's why we're seeing these levels of obesity.
And I think that's why we really
And that's
mustn't
why-
stigmatize these, as you say, Laurie, this is an education. Look at your label. That'll help
And
you.
that's also why we need to have these regulations to regulate the food and beverage industry, because they're the organizations that need to be regulated to improve the food environment rather than focusing on the individuals. I think.
Absolutely critical. Laurie?
There's a fantastic book that's just been published in England by Chris van Tulliken called Ultra Processed People. And the key message you'll take home from that is it's not you.
Yeah.
It's the food.
Yeah.
And I think this is really what the fronted pack labeling is about. It's getting us to look at what's in our food a whole lot more carefully.
Yep.
Instead of it all being hidden and obscured by the fine print.
And promoted as being fabulous.
And promoted as being good for the developing
Wolf in
brain.
sheep's clothing.
You think about all the lovely advertising that goes on a cereal box. You'd think you were creating a genius every morning. Yeah. There's not a word about what's happening in
reality.
In reality, which is sort of diabetes, 20, 30 years on. Yeah.
Yes, I've got another two, so we'll take the microphone to both of you. Let's start, Marianne, with you.
Thank you. Marianne Weeks from Northwest University, and it's fantastic being here and learning from you and hearing your passion about it. And I really feel that this is really a step in the right direction and a required and a needed step. And I think especially in the context of our children, as I know the focus of today is mainly on children, because we know the consumers, the children of today are the consumers of the future. So we really need to protect our children. So really in support of it as well. And I was just wondering, in terms of, we're talking a lot about these foods and them being more affordable and more accessible, especially in our lower income settings. And we know that, unfortunately, our whole foods, majority our vegetables and fruits and our dairy products, especially whole milk, is more expensive than these foods. And I was wondering, in terms of the opportunity for reformulation, if that was something that you looked at when you did your work, in terms of, because we're nudging towards, we do want the whole foods to become more accessible and affordable, but we know that's not something that's going to happen immediately. Whereas the warning labels, if this regulation gets enforced, it's something that will happen immediately and hopefully nudge people towards the right direction when we hope these other things will happen. So I was wondering, in terms of the opportunity for reformulation, if that was something that was explored, because I'm reflecting back on the sodium regulation, and the sodium regulation is something that's received a lot of success and a lot of support. And we've seen reformulation, and one of our co-researchers, one of our good friends, Dr. Bianca van der Westhuizen, recently published an article looking at the compliance of food industry towards these sodium regulations. And it seems as if we're doing good in that sense, and we're really moving towards the right step. But
I want to just interrupt you and say, you'll remember, however, when that regulation came in, the industry said, this is impossible, we'll not be able to do this.
Exactly. So
what we're hearing now.
Yes, so that's why I'm reflecting on that. That's exactly why I'm reflecting on it, and what I'm wondering about it is, the opportunity for this, because we've seen good compliance now with the sodium regulation, which is a massive step towards the right direction. And you also commented on it, Taryn, you said we've got so many good policies and regulations in the country, and the enforcement of it is sometimes questionable, but now we're seeing movement in that sense. So I think that's my one question, is the possibility for reformulation, if that was something that you explored, whether it is possible. And then the other thing is just a comment in terms of, I agree 100% that something that we need to talk about is monitoring. Again, it also touches on the 214 and then with R991. And the responsibility that we as nutrition experts, as researchers, have in terms of also playing a role in the monitoring, but that we've also got a massive responsibility in terms of education, in terms of educating our scholars, educating the community in terms of not only the regulation, but the motivation behind the regulation. And I think that's also a place maybe where the sodium regulation had a success in terms of motivating the education, because we had Salt Watch and we had all of these big things happening. And I think that's something that we maybe should talk about in terms of this regulation, is where do we have it? Can we have a Salt Watch? Can we have something that can educate? Because we understand the motivation behind this. But like we say in Afrikaans, Jan Alleman on the street might not be able to understand the motivation. So I think if we, like you said, Laurie, educate ourselves, educate the people that we are in contact with, educate the industry, educate everyone, we can have a joint movement towards promoting this and ultimately maybe monitoring it as well. Because the Department of Health does not have the resources to do this themselves. We need to support them, and the onus falls on us to try and help them to get there, because it's at the end for the better of
But
South
I think
Africa.
that's exactly what we are saying, is how do people come together?
Yes.
And we need to, if we want to be the change, we must lead the change.
We must. We need
So
to.
it needs to be saying, like Salt Watch, who's going to, like, that's why there is Healer. How do we empower and strengthen those organizations to be able to do what we know the Department of Health is not able to do? And I think that's a really important point. On the issue of reformulation, I think, Tamron, you alluded to the fact that, well, when the sugar tax came in, everybody reformulated, but they did it the simple way of, oh, well, let's just get the sugar to below the level and put in non-nutritive sweeteners to get us up. To now, it's going to actually have to encourage, I want to almost say, reformulation with thought and with the right motivation behind it, because it's going to be significant reformulation that has to happen. What did you kind of hear? And
I think if the food industry really actually cares about health and not about profits, they would not be looking at how to reformulate from one ultra-processed food to another ultra-processed food. They would be looking at how to change our very broken food supply to something that actually has healthy foods. So I think we know that the for-profit motives don't sort of align with the health motives that we try to promote. But what we can certainly say, if we look across the world, anytime these types of policies are implemented, food and industry says, we can't, this is going to be too difficult. Once it gets implemented, when you look at the regulation, what is their sugar content? Just below the regulation. What is their sodium content? Just below the cutoff. They can do it. They can do it very easily. But they're going to push the limits as much as they can. And we continuously see them influencing regulations by weakening them and by pushing the cut points. We saw it with the health promotion levy in South Africa that was originally proposed to be a much higher cut point that got weakened considerably as a result of the sugar beverage influence. And yeah, they can do the reformulation for sure. They're just going to push it as much as they can.
And they're going to give us all the same stories of the costs, the job losses, the other impacts. Laurie, it looks like you wanted to add.
I was just also thinking about the marketing piece, and the way in which industry targets children. That's to do with where the adverts get put up, the timing of them on TV, the content. That's all trying to tap into these children as an emerging market, the emerging tastes for salty and sweet foods, the pester power that a child has within the family, and then knowing that whatever taste is set early in childhood is going to pull through into adolescence. So there's a real need to raise awareness of that kind of exploitative marketing practices taking
And I think
place.
in some ways, when this regulation comes in place and we see what will not be allowed, we're going to see stripping away, of as we see the cereal box, we're going to see and we're going to really suddenly be aware of how much, because I think so much of what happens in the marketing is very subliminal, and you don't really notice it. I'm absolutely horrified that right near my home is a very prestigious private school that has a building on a main road that is 4 stories. It is wrapped in an advertisement from a sugar-sweetened beverage 4 stories high. And every parent drives, a child is driven past that. And then just across the road from the entrance of the school, there's one of the most renowned fast food takeaway. And as you said, that is not done unconsciously by these companies. And that is targeting. So yes, as we're going to watch these regulations come into force for the children, the stripping away is going to be a fascinating. As I stood in front of the cereal shelf yesterday, I was charged with buying our props for the session. I, just looked at it and I thought, how different is this shelf going to look like? Not only with the warning labels, which are going to probably be bigger than what we've got on this cereal box. I didn't get it quite right. But in terms of what we're actually going to just visually see as well, warning labels plus a whole lot less of these other things, I got really excited standing there thinking, when's this regulation going to happen?
It's a bit, as you were talking, the image that came to mind was the emperor has no clothes. We've been seduced by the packaging, the glamour of it all. And at some point, a dietitian put her hand up and said, well, actually.
But your point is really important. And then we'll hand the microphone to Christine. But your point is really important that we've got to decide. I think what you're saying, and I'm encouraging you and us, let's make it happen. Let's get together. Let's talk as researchers. What can we do? Let's talk as civil society. How can we strengthen it? Because I can promise you, when we're talking profit, I tell you when the manufacturers will listen, when the consumer demands. That's absolutely, because that's whose pocket they're drawing from. So we've got to find those entrances to get the consumers demanding these.
I think the other thing, we've talked a lot about the challenges of families living in poor households and in what we call food deserts, so communities where healthy foods are pretty much unavailable. But it's also important to recognize that these same products, unhealthy products high in salt, sugar, fat, are also consumed in excessive quantities by your middle classes, your upper classes. They are pervasive. And so we need to be educating the whole of society. This is not just a problem of poverty. It's worse.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The choices are more limited because finance is limited. But this is a whole of society problem. Absolutely. And it requires a whole of society
solution.
Approach.
Yep. Christine, finally, I'm giving the microphone to you.
Good morning. My name is Christine Thayer-Krichel. I'm from the Northwest University, and I teach community nutrition for 3rd and 4th year students. And so I find myself in the community more often than not. And my question is about, and I think, Tammy, it would be directed to you, but just about I think the key purpose of the warning labels in labeling a food, good versus bad, than enabling the consumer to make an informed choice. And I'll give a little bit of background, but I think it's important, and Laurie, you have highlighted it, but the complexity within one specific South African household. And so, yes, you can have the stunted child, the overweight mom, the malnourished elderly, the husband working a hard physical job. And so within that, there's already, I mean, we speak about quadruple burden of disease. And so let's say we still find at our clinics quite a high number of children being malnourished, stunted. And it might be that the best that mom can do at that time is using what she has. Now, it's not good. It's not, probably it's like you say, 3 or 4 of that products will have that label on it, but that is what she has at the moment. And I'll take a stupid example like peanut butter. I mean, we would still say for a stunted child, using what you have, and if she has peanut butter in, and it might be that peanut butter will have a label on it, but that is the best that she has at the moment to incorporate in that child's porridge. And so just your thoughts about stigmatization, like you said, and then the good versus bad, labeling a product, instead of just enabling the mom or the, when can such a product actually then be used? Because I guess processed foods will still be with us for some time.
Christine, if you'll pass the microphone to the gentleman in front of you, and I'll give you the floor next. Let's just deal with this comment, and then I promise I'm going to come to you. Yeah, I mean, this is what I was saying. It is going to be, are we going to make mothers feel guilty that in their shopping baskets they have some things that are carrying these warning labels, but this is what they can afford? How do we deal with this?
So let me take a stab, and I think this is a really important issue because it's about ethics as well.
Yeah.
Cameron said more than 45% in rural areas already eating processed foods. 92% is eating processed foods. The real question is, how do we make healthier foods and
Accessible,
health-giving foods available? And that comes down to the demand. Because when we want, what is this new hybrid cars? Yeah, because of the planet, there's a demand. And so the manufacturer comes to the table. When you want to have a phone that's not as big as a brick and can process quickly, the manufacturer comes to the table. We haven't seen that pushback when it comes to food. And the reason why we haven't seen that pushback is because the people like us in this room, we are not eating the ultra processed food basket that a household is eating on 350 Rand. Until we can get that demand, all of us need to push for it. We need actually to be having an audit of the foods that are on the shelf and saying, if this food is not giving any health, not that it's bad, because we're looking at the content of sugar, individual nutrients, but if this food is not health giving, it shouldn't be on the shelf. That is far reaching. That is what some of the states in India started to do when they were looking at what is on the shelf and what is health providing, health giving. I think a lot more foods have to fall off the shelf. A lot more foods that are on the shelf are filling, are nice, but are they health promoting? I doubt it. And at some point, consumers have to push back. Consumers can't do that until they have the literacy. And if we don't invest in the literacy, and I think this was in, many of us know Professor Labadarius. I think 2005 was the first request for a national nutrition literacy program in South Africa. And we need to keep pushing for that. So both the academia and the civil society have to push for it.
And it's what we were hearing earlier is we have food-based dietary guidelines for South Africa, but ask any South African if they know about them. They don't know about them. So again, it's so often we put these policies in place, and then they sit on a shelf and they gather dust, or we don't communicate them. Rory, do you want to add, and then I'll come? Okay, super, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Chandu Kashiram. I'm on the board with Chantel, recently joined HEALA. I'm not a food nutritionist expert in that, but my background is in corporate and governance. And I think there's an opportunity in influencing corporates in a different way. The reason I say that, it comes from the King reports. So the first King report that came out was, let's move beyond profit to people, profit, and planet. What's happening now in corporate is that there's a major shift to ESG, ethics, sustainability, and governance. And big corporates have to prove that they're going to be sustainable for the next generation and leave the planet in a better place. So we've done a lot of work in corporates in terms of the planet becoming a better place, and we use climate change. And climate change reporting in the annual report has increased significantly. My background is with Cecil, for example, and in terms of emissions reporting, they've had to come to the party to report emissions in terms of climate change regulation. The regulation here, in addition to food packaging, should also compel these big manufacturers to report on what are they doing in terms of their reformulation of their products to, maybe I could use the words nutrition transitioning, just like climate change transitioning from fossil fuels to new energy, renewable energy. We can start a drive through this community to say, what is your nutrition transition plans as a large manufacturer?
And the great news I can give you is there is a global, the Access to Nutrition Index, the ATNI index, already exists that is trying to do this, but it's the matter of trying to get more of uptake and get more. And in fact, the Access to Nutrition Index is also trying to encourage investors not to invest in companies that don't, and they're asking companies this. So it could be like making sure within South Africa, because the problem with the ATNI index is that there's not again, it needs funding and it needs to be able to do it. But it's amazing what they're showing that shows us that we haven't, that these companies aren't doing it. So it would be almost a South African Access to Nutrition Index is what you're I love the idea.
And also what also happened is that with regulation, there was impact on these big manufacturers because the funders, the institutionals, that the shareholders.
Exactly.
There was more shareholder activism to say, if you can't prove how you're going to sustain your company beyond just profits for today, then even the investors started pushing back because yes, I can make a few bucks in the next 5 years. What's going to happen to this company in 10, 15, 20 years? And the big problem for corporates that are pushing profits now with the refined products is how are they going to be sustainable when a whole generation moves beyond sugar and sodium to whole foods? They're going to be out of business. And that should be a compelling reason for them to change their way of thinking.
I love it. Thank you so much for that addition. Laurie, I saw you wanting to chip in. Yeah. No, I think that is why we're saying it's coming back to this. It's got to be a whole of society movement. We cannot just expect government to constantly have to regulate and enforce. Yes, that's part of the process. That's part of fixing our broken food systems. But we need to have all of these. And the great thing is when you start digging, there are movements. There is an Access to Nutrition Global Index. There are civil society organizations like HeLa. There are these, but it's again that the individual would be greater if we all came together than each of us doing our individual bits and pieces. And how can we use this opportunity of this regulatory moment to make it more than the regulation, but actually to make it the major shift that we need to see on all these little elements that we've spoken about? It's a big job.
Hi, so my name is Petronelle Kruger. I'm a public health lawyer with Priceless. We have a much longer name, but I won't delve into that now. I'm I'm happy we're moving the conversation to companies, and I'm unhappy about the way we're doing it. I, for example, do not rate the ATN index at all. It's a health washing mechanism. And I think when we're having this discussion about the role of corporates, what we're missing is that these ultra-processed food companies are not South African companies. So effectively what we're doing is we are taking economic development out of our country. We're filling the coffers of a bunch of shareholders sitting in Switzerland, and they're very happy to externalize the health implication of society because it doesn't impact their health system if we have more obesity in South Africa. It doesn't impact their planetary health if we bottle, I'm assuming we can't say brands here based on what's on stage, but if we bottle big sodas here, and those plastics wash into our rivers and they don't care. And I think we need to move past the illusion that big food companies care. They care about profit. And I think you phrased it well, and you phrased it correctly. It was about the sustainability of companies internally, right? So you can maybe convince a company using a business case that we should keep people alive for longer because we need to feed them, but it's not because they want us to be healthy. And then the problem, of course, starts coming in when we now have these magic obesity drugs. So all of a sudden, Novo Nordisk is really interested in World Hypertension Day, but we know why, because make us fat and then give us pills to make us skinny. And that means we're dependent on them for absolutely everything. I mean, we have the Phyllis Morris Foundation now doing healthcare, which is, I mean, ridiculous. So when we have these conversations, it's really important for us to think about, yeah, we're discussing the carrot and education, and that's great. And, you know, yes, a limited amount of personal responsibility, but we need one hell of a stick. And we need to start slapping these companies with these sticks because people are dying. You know, we were talking about, you were saying, Chantal, the food basket being 360, that you say 4 or 5 rand. You know, overweight and obesity on a really low estimate costs this country per person 2,700 rand a year. We could literally give the COVID grant for 8 months more to everyone, and we'll see no impact on our coffers if we can eliminate this unhealthy component of our lifestyle. And that's really a low estimate. And when we're talking about things like national health insurance and how we can actually make that happen, one of the really big concerns right now is how do we deal with this burden of overweight and obesity? So this is a much larger conversation, and I'm assuming we don't want to get sued, so that's why those companies' names are being covered up. But we need to stigmatize these companies because they're killing us. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, and really think that you're giving us that very sage advice. Is that at the end of the day, it is that we've got to punish them. We've got to name and shame. We've got to make it hurt, because perhaps trying to be nice, if I'm putting it, doesn't work, is what I'm hearing from your voice. So thank you very much for taking the floor. Anyone else? Yes, let's get the microphone. No, it's lovely. We want everyone part of the conversation. You can come back as many times as you like, everyone. This is a conversation.
It's enjoyable in the situation. And if you know me well, you know I like talking. So, yeah, so thank you for that. And I think it's what you were saying is it's so important that we name and shame. And I think that's maybe also where we've seen the success with R991. My question is, in terms of, you know, many of us here are nutrition experts. We don't have the law knowledge that you've got. And I'm concerned about maybe limitations within the regulation. You touched on it just early in terms of maybe looking at the legal aspects of it. So I'm just wondering, in terms of when you talk about giving comments on this regulation, in terms of giving comments that's helpful in the sense of getting something passed, that it would be that we don't see a draft regulation for the next 10 years again, because that's what happened with 429. It was published 2014, and it's been almost 10 years, because we know that food industry have got massive knowledge. They've got wonderful lawyers, and I'm wondering about, we really need to think about, I don't know, about loopholes or places in the regulation that might hinder its implementation because of some possible laws. Because I'm just thinking now about something like Coco the monkey on a cereal box. What is the implication of a company-owned character and a regulation prohibiting a company-owned character from being on a package? I'm
going to
for
just
it.
jump in there and tell you that I've spoken to a lawyer in this area, and the answer is they're not taking away your brand. You can still have your brand. They're allowed to limit the use of your brand.
Okay.
So that certainly is, and there's precedence law in, and I'm not a lawyer either.
Yes.
But because I had a similar concern, we had this discussion. So I mean, you will also see, we said we're only touching on one part of this law. There are a number of brand names.
I know, because I'm thinking
that
about
will go in this law.
Because I'm thinking of something like a bottle, a baby bottle, and I'm thinking about R991, and I think it's very important to reflect back on previous regulations, the successes that these previous regulations have had, looking at the current regulation, seeing possible, where were these successes in these previous regulations? What can we learn from previous regulations, and how can this assist us in implementing something that is implementable and enforceable, and building on it? Because I was sitting here and thinking about marketing of foods to children. It's something that's really close to my heart and something that I'm really passionate about. And I was thinking about, it's easy to change the box, but in terms of product placement, where do we place the products in the stores? Something like social media, because we're just talking about television advertising. And I don't know about you, but in our house, when we don't watch a lot of television, but we do watch television, we don't watch the channels anymore that's got advertisements on it. We watch something like Netflix, where you can skip to the next episode without advertisement, and simple missing places of advertising that's maybe happening here. So, I'm just saying that I think in terms of, we need to look at previous successes and try and evaluate the current regulation in its form, seeing where are there loopholes that might hinder the implementation, because we don't want a 10-year process to be waiting again. But then also thinking forward, monitoring, continuously improving on it, because new places are popping up. Thinking of Instagram, Facebook, things like that. And our children are exposed to those type of marketing. It's not just more the billboard that they are facing, but in terms of implementation of these things, it's very, very hard. But I don't think we should, I think we should maybe start with what is achievable now, and how can we continuously build on that, improve on that, but get something implemented.
And I think
because
that's
we
what's
need
important.
that.
But what has to happen first, and we've got to remember that this is, and we're going to come as we come towards the close, this is a draft regulation. Comments have to be in by the 21st of July. We're close to the end, and we need to be making sure that comments, at the very least, imperfect in some ways we might think it is, we need to be seeing and supporting this regulation to go through. There might be other areas. I say there's many areas in this regulation. There might be other areas where there's errors, but at the very least, we've got to have the starting point, because the journey has to begin somewhere. And I think what I'm hearing is it then takes a movement of putting legal brains from Priceless together with brains from HELA, with our academic partners, and saying, right, how are we going to support, therefore, the implementation and the monitoring of this, that we are then continuing the journey. And it's what I keep saying, that we don't just see getting a regulation through as that's it done.
Exactly. And that's my point, I think, in a summary, is to say that we need to get this implemented. So we need to help it to be implemented. So we need to think of you know, we've got this fantastic illusion of what we really, really, really want. And we want it. We want to move there. But in reality, what can we do now? And then from there, we build on it and we grow it and we make it stronger and we push it forward. But let's just first get it implemented and not on the shelf again for 10 years. And I think that is where we need to be realistic and taking hands and joining expertise, because there's a lot of people who's going to kick against it. And we need to be aware of the areas that are going to kick against it. And I think, as I said, reflecting back on successes might support us in getting there.
Great point. Laurie?
I think the other thing that we have seen is a growing push internationally in support of these kind of marketing restrictions. So just yesterday, the World Health Organization issued a set of guidelines calling on all states to introduce mandatory guidelines prohibiting marketing
Social
of
media.
unhealthy foods to all children. That's from 0 to 18. So we've seen guidelines from World Health Organization, guidelines from UNICEF. We've seen a series of Lancet commissions calling for clearer, stronger regulation of corporate interests. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has issued a general comment outlining businesses' responsibility to respect children's rights. We know here in South Africa that children's rights and best interests are of paramount importance in any matter affecting a child or a group of children. So there's a very strong body of evidence, there's strong global guidance, and a really strong rights-based argument that supports these regulations. So for me, anyone who cares about children and child health and nutrition in South Africa, anyone cares about the protection of children from exploitative marketing practices, and anyone who cares about protecting children from foods that are harmful to health should be supporting this regulation and should be making an individual or an organizational submission by the 21st.
And then we need to be saying, okay, now to this point of how do we then also come together and actually look at the strengths of each one of the role players and actually come together to make it, to do what we need to do to keep it going. I think that's also what I'm hearing from this meeting. I'm going to look at this side of the room because I know we've missed some hands here. Yes, Pamela, and then I'll come to the other comment. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela, and I represent Saxo Watch. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. I think our biggest challenge is at the individual and household level. If we're being really realistic, how are we going to convince impoverished, unemployed South Africans to choose wholesome foods that are more expensive, that take longer to prepare? And then we have load shedding, and I can also share from personal experience, it's very challenging to feed a child during this load shedding things, the load shedding sessions that we have. And I was hoping that the National Department of Health could maybe just comment as the custodians and the people that we expect to lead this effort, and also the enacting of this regulation. What is their perspective? I don't know if they're here today, especially when it comes to social behavior change communication, to really make people switch to healthier choices. Thank you.
And I think that's what we're saying. That's good. That is the next challenge. It's an existing challenge. It's not the next, but
I think we've got two challenges. I mean, I agree that there's a huge challenge at the level of individuals, families, particularly caregivers of children, in grappling with how to afford healthy foods. But the elephant in the room is industry, right?
Yeah.
That's the immediate challenge. And industry will push back against this set of regulations because it is going to impact on their bottom line.
Yeah.
And at the moment, they're externalizing those costs. It's our families and communities who are carrying the burden of disease, and that does need to change.
And I think also, I think it's important to realize one regulation is not going to solve everything. lots of gaps. There's lots that still needs to be done. And I think Marianne was saying about, we need to show support to Department of Health because we know industry is going to come, and they're going to come with a combined voice giving the same message of all the problems they're going to be pointing out. We also need to be making sure that we are showing support of the things that are good in place. Of course, there's a lot more that needs to be done. There's a lot that isn't addressed in this regulation. But at least we can focus on the things that it is achieving.
If we can pass the microphone, thank you.
Good morning. I'm Estelle Venter, also representing ATSA. I have a bit more of a technical question on the regulations. How clear is it what types of foods will be included or excluded, especially in terms of, for example, takeaways or other catering services? Do we have clarity about that yet?
So I can comment on the section on the warning labels to say that there is a clear criteria, and that is on packaged foods, and then they have to either contain added sodium, added saturated fat, or free sugar or sweetener. And if they contain one of those, then the nutrient profiling model criteria applies to it. When it comes to the marketing restrictions, it is the warning label foods. There's also a section under marketing that appears to address that foods from takeaway establishments will also be covered by that.
And it's important to remember it's added. So it's added fat, it's added sugar, it's added sodium. And I know there's some things where, as the regulation comes in, will have to be discussed. So, for example, will a packet of sugar have to carry a warning label because it's not added sugar, it's sugar? Will an oil, a bottle of oil, so they are those where you've got to look at. And in terms of, as far as I understand, the quick service restaurants are not included in the warning labels, but in the advertising, there's already, I think, some other areas where they are included. So you've got to read it really carefully. But at this point, this regulation is aimed at packaged food products. And it's why we say there's a bigger story to be told and a bigger area that we have to deal with. But this part of the regulation focuses on the packaged foods and their promotion to children.
Thank you. I was also, now that we're on the technical side, I was also interested in and wondered about, especially that what you were referring to, Tamara, in terms of added saturated fat. So we're not talking about the intrinsic self-saturated fat content of the food product, because I was wondering about something, for instance, like dairy foods. We see quite a high natural saturated fat content. So if you can maybe just, I don't know if this is a conversation for this now or...
So they won't carry the added, but for example, many butters will, because they actually have added saturated fat to the butter.
Perhaps I could.
Yeah.
So the philosophy behind it is that one doesn't want our whole foods, our fresh, raw ingredients like an apple to carry a high in sugar label, or even a piece of meat that contains saturated fat in its natural form. That is not addressed by this. The idea is that it's products that have got these added excessive amounts. So when it comes to dairy, for instance, if it's a dairy drink, the moment it has an added ingredient, one of those added ingredients, the criteria applies, and the criteria then assesses all. So it's the total saturated fat of the product. So it may well, because the nutrient profiling model is for the total, but it is particularly focused on those types of products that we know are being manufactured in factories with all sorts of industrialized processes that we are wanting to target. And that's why it's got this criteria.
And my point is, we might be quite surprised by ones that have to carry warning labels that we didn't think had added. I mean, for example, I just used butter as an example. Butter is not just butter. If you look at the many butters, they are added other ingredients that might well bring them to having to carry the warning labels. So it's to your point, we want to encourage the whole foods, if we want a better definition for it, and to really be looking at these packaged foods. Laurie?
I think it's also things like yogurt, where you think you're making a healthy choice
Yep.
for your child.
Yep.
And you haven't read the little nutrient profile, where these labels are going to be particularly helpful. When you can look at the different products on a shelf and you can say, I'm not going to have the extra sweetened strawberry yogurt. I'm going to go for the healthy option.
Yeah.
And maybe when I get home, I'll add fruit.
Yeah.
Or honey.
Yeah. Anybody else? Have I
right to know what's in our food, our right to understand the system that is manipulating our food choices is equally important, because it's so often hidden and obscured. So the consumer rights piece is central. And then it's a broader food justice issue. So when we talked about it in Engage, we talked about the slow violence of malnutrition. It's something that should be making us angry. What is happening to our children is unjust, it's exploitative, it's inequitable, and we're allowing these companies to profit off our children. So I'm hoping that for those people listening in, that you are feeling similarly outraged, and because of that, you will use your voice and your power as a consumer and as a citizen to speak up and to support both these regulations and all other efforts to create a healthy and affordable food environment for all South Africans.
Laurie, you've nicely given me what I was going to say at the close, which is what is your call to action to our audience? And I think you've now started it. Is there anything more you want to add on the call to action? I mean, you've given a very loud one. And I think the slow violence is such a powerful imagery for me.
It's a slow violence, but it's also a sugary, sweet, and salty violence.
Yep.
You know, it's so sugar coated we don't see the bitter pill that lies at the center.
There's a lovely
and the heart
quote.
of it.
Yep. Tamara, what would your call to action be to our audience?
We've seen the previous draft regulations sit on the shelf for a very long time. We don't want this regulation to sit on the shelf again. We need to counteract the food and beverage industry, and we need to show support to the Department of Health. So please make a public submission and show your support and provide your input where you would like things to be improved on. But take that action. You know, I think it's so easy for us to sit back and complain about all the problems, but let's try and make a little bit of time to do something proactive and show our support of this regulation.
Chantal?
To everybody who has a diabetic in your household, a hypertensive in your household, a child, it's your responsibility to protect your health. And I think if you need assistance, you can go to the Healer website to assist you to make that submission. Everybody needs to make a submission because we know industry will be making submissions and we don't want a one-sided conversation, and that's, we need to support our government. So I think from Healer, we'd want to lend support so that anybody who's interested to protect your health, your child's health, we would like to help you. And we will be making a submission, of course.
And so that's a reminder to everyone. The submission date is the 21st of July. It's around the corner. We need to have our submissions in. The regulation gives you where the submissions go. Food control at health.gov.za. But it's clearly there in the regulations, or reach out to anyone here who will happily help you get the information. But I think silence isn't an option when we are looking at our children. We have got to speak out and be their voices, for they can't be speaking on this issue. So it's going to be up to all of us. But what I want to also say is don't make it only a submission. Let's look then what's going to happen thereafter, that we are going to do what we've talked about today and really harness the strengths of many people, because we're up against a very powerful industry where when you put profit before consumers, we've got a real battle ahead of us. I want to just thank, before I call for our closing remarks from our colleague from UNICEF, I want to thank our three panelists, but I want to thank all of you in the room for also actively engaging. And I want to thank to all of you who have been online listening to us, and I'm hope writing perhaps in the chat box. But we really want to say that this has been a great opportunity for us to really highlight an important issue. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. Makoma, thank you also for setting the scene for us. Really appreciate it. And I think you're welcome to move down, but I'm going to invite our colleague and friend Gilbert Chidzaudzi, who's the nutrition specialist at UNICEF South Africa, to give us some closing remarks before we end the session. Thank you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Jane. I think mine is it's an easier task, but really to start, we really want to thank everyone who was part of really putting this very, very important roundtable discussion. And on behalf of UNICEF, I shouldn't be saying this because our head of agencies here, but we really want to thank her for really giving us an opportunity, let's say as technical people, to really put together this roundtable discussion to ensure that, you know, the voice of the children of South Africa becomes part of this conversation. We really want to thank, you know, the Mail and Guardian who allowed us to use their platform to really start this very important conversation. This is just the beginning of the conversation. We're not there yet. And I think it was very clear from all the participants here that this is just a piece of the puzzle. There are other puzzles that we still need to look at to transform this broken food system in South Africa so that it can work for children, because they are our future. Hence, we are all here. So we'll also want to thank, you know, our moderator, our panel members for your time. You are not paid to do this, but really you gave your time freely to this conversation so that we can make a meaningful contribution, so that we can start speaking on behalf of our children. I really want to thank you. I'd like to thank all our guests, those who joined us in person, as well as those who joined us online. Thank you very much. And we hope that you are going to do the right thing. On or before the 21st of July, you are going to submit your written comments to the National Department of Health. And the email address again is foodcontrol@health.gov.za. Of course, as UNICEF South Africa will also be making our written comments to in support of this important initiative. So I think I want to reiterate your words, Jane, that silence is not an option. Let's speak on behalf of our children. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everybody. Those of you that are here, you're going to be hopefully joining us for a lunch. And those of you that are online, thank you. We look forward to lots of submissions. So thank you, everyone.